Welcome. This is Jeremy Finger with Riverbend Wealth Management. Welcome to the webinar today. We're going to go over a lot of things that are going to be very, very helpful. A little bit about me. I've been in business well over 23 years. Worked with some wirehouses, Wells Fargo Advisors, Merrill Lynch. Started my own firm, Riverbend Wealth Management, that uses fidelity investments and independent, meaning that I'm a fiduciary. I can use about any product or service with no conflicts of interest at all, no proprietary products or anything. And my intention for you today is to get some good information that you can take home and think about and do some actionable steps for you to help improve your financial life. Okay. I have with me today John Diehl, who is with the Hartford. He works with the MIT Age Lab that studies aging and retirees and the aging process. And so, John, I'm gonna hand it off to you and tell you a little bit about yourself and some of the things we're gonna be going over.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on today. And by way of background, as Jeremy said, my name is John Diehl. I've worked with Hartford and Hartford Funds now for just shy of 32 years. But the last 20 years, I've spent studying consumer behavior, the influence of technology, changing lifestyles, decision-making, all in conjunction with our research partners at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Age Lab. And I head up a team now of 6 folks who take the learnings from the projects that we help develop at MIT, and we share those with financial advisors and, more importantly, with their clients. And so I've really enjoyed working with you, Jeremy, over the past couple of years, and really appreciate the opportunity to join with your clients today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a little bit of housekeeping. You can more than welcome to ask questions. Hit the Q&A at the bottom of the screen or the chat, and I'll try to monitor that as we go on. But yeah, thank you very much, John. I appreciate all your help and take it away.
Absolutely. So, Jeremy, today's presentation, we're going to be talking about actually a field of study that I worked on with MIT beginning back in 2008. But it's very pertinent to where we find ourselves today in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And the name of the presentation is Maintaining Perspective in a Crisis. Because as we start to think about what's going on, the influence of, and the first thing I'll say, Jeremy, is certainly this virus is a real thing, right? And I don't mean to minimize the impact of the virus in terms of perhaps even within our neighborhoods, within our families, and maybe even we ourselves have had interaction with this virus. But my hope is that everybody is staying safe and healthy. But what I do want to share with you is from the research perspective. Maintaining perspective in the midst of a crisis is very important, especially when it comes to your financial plans and your long-term objectives, because we know, and we'll talk about through this presentation today, how people who are in the midst of a crisis under great anxiety tend to react emotionally. And most of us probably understand it's easy to say when we're not in crisis, but when we make emotional decisions, we're very apt to make mistakes. And so let me just explain a little bit first about who the MIT Age Lab is and what they do. So the MIT Age Lab is actually in MIT School of Engineering. It's about 40 researchers, not all engineers. There are sociologists, psychologists, you name it, a whole host of ologists, really studying what it means that Americans today are very likely to live in their 80s, 90s, and beyond. They're looking at consumer behavior and decision-making and how those things are influenced by changing demographics, the impact of technology, and a shift of lifestyles. And so the MIT Age Lab is actually working with industries and companies, not just in the United States, but around the world, helping to think about how all these things come together to create new demand, new needs for systems, and maybe new ways of thinking. I'll just give you a brief example, Jeremy, for your clients, is that you'll see on my slide the researchers there. are leaning up against a Volkswagen Beetle. The auto industry is one of the leading clients of the MIT Age Lab. That Volkswagen Beetle is the only $2 million Beetle you're ever going to find, because that car is tricked out with all kinds of technology meant to measure driver acceptance of new technologies in the car. Maybe some of you today drive automobiles that are equipped with blind spot warning systems, safe cruise control systems, smart headlights, reverse monitoring systems. Many of those systems were developed with the aging driver in mind, because as we age, reflexes slow, muscle atrophy sets in, even neck rotation becomes more limited. By incorporating technologies into the automobile, we've actually made it safer for older drivers. You may be wondering the funny suits that those folks are wearing, the researchers are wearing. They're actually wearing an aging suit. That suit, it looks like coveralls, but has belts and straps, a collar, helmet, goggles. It's meant to calibrate what it would feel like for anyone to be 80, 85, 90 years old. So as we think about limited mobility in the limbs or impaired vision, neuropathy in the feet, or decreased neck rotation, by putting people into that suit, which was designed by students at Harvard Med along with the engineers at MIT, we can begin to gain some empathy. And think about it, when it comes time for a product designer to design a new product or a new service, what better way than for them to experience it themselves, as one of their clients may in the future. So just a little background there to orient you with kind of who this group is that we're focused on their research today. Because in today's presentation, we really want to talk about the relationship between stress, anxiety, and crisis. We'll talk about the instinctual behaviors that we may have to check ourselves in our own behaviors. It's not really our fault. It oftentimes happens unconsciously, but if we're aware of what some of the behaviors are, maybe we can take steps towards maintaining perspective and making better decisions, especially during times of crisis and anxiety. So let's start by talking about stress, anxiety, and crisis. And the first thing I want to stress, if no pun intended, is what stress actually is. See, stress is really the disruption of any kind of normalcy. Think of throwing the pebble into a pool. The pebble is the stressor, the stress, or the waves that result from it. You can have good stress or bad stress. An example of good stress would be you didn't expect a surprise birthday party when you walked into your home, but surprise, well, we like that kind of stress. We don't like distress. Distress is the negative stress, the upsetting stress, the thing that really serves and it starts to kick up our emotions, and especially our fear emotion. So let me just touch on the difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is an emotional response to a clear and present danger. So when I walked into the room today, let's say there was a snake under my desk, right? We all know what would happen, right? We've heard it time and time again. We're either going to run like heck or we're going to fight that thing. Fight or flight response is the human reaction to fear. Fear is an emotion that presents itself in light of a clear and present danger, but that's different from anxiety. Anxiety is actually, if you think about it, the fear of a fear. Anxiety is the anticipation of a clear present danger, whether it's real or not. And in our current crisis, this is where we're kind of stuck between is it a real fear or is it anxiety? Right? We know that the virus is, it showed up in Washington State, it's in New York, now it's in my state, my county, my neighborhood. Perhaps I know someone who got it. Are our actions being driven by fear or anxiety? And I will tell you, what we feel as human beings is also being felt in the financial markets. When you see great volatility, it's oftentimes because there's a lot of emotion, there's unknown outcomes. Nobody's quite sure of what's going on, and that emotion seems to grab the moment, resulting in wild swings in all kinds of different markets. And so, understand the difference between fear and anxiety. And lastly, the word crisis. Crisis is not, I think it's the most overused word in the media today, right? But what a crisis really is, it's when you get to a stage in a sequence of events where from here on out, nothing else is going to be the same. I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has caused a crisis. Jeremy and I were just talking that I was in conversation with Dr. Joe Coughlin, who heads the Age Lab yesterday, and Dr. Coughlin said what this crisis is doing is accelerating a lot of things that might have actually occurred over the next 5 to 10 years. Take what we're doing right now, virtual conferencing, right? Being able to talk to one another virtually, no matter where in the country we are. We might have casually tried it a couple of times, but most think that on the other side of this crisis, we'll be using these kind of technologies to speak not only from a business or an education standpoint, and I don't even want to get into the implications for educational institutions, but we may use it to talk to family members and friends much more than we did prior to the crisis. So that's just one simple example of what a crisis really is. So I really want to talk to you, and you'll notice on this screen that says crisis, we put a bunch of different headlines up, right, which go back to the Great Depression in some cases, but you might realize, what some of these things were, and you'll see the flattening the curve crisis over on the right side of the screen. My point in the next few slides to share with you is that although every crisis is unique in certain aspects, it's usually called a crisis because we've never dealt with it before. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, beyond their unique characteristics, crises actually do share things in common. Let me explain. The graph that I have in front of you is called the issue life cycle or the crisis life cycle. You'll see attention on one axis and time on the other. Most crises today in the United States stick in public perception on an average of about 30 days. It's usually like 30 to 45 days. Not that those crises can't spin out other sub-crises, if you will, and we can talk about that a little bit. But let me just explain, and I want you, as you think about this graph in front of you, I want you not just to think about the current crisis, but I want you to think back in your life to other crises that we've lived through. Maybe you go back to 2008-9, the Great Recession, or maybe back to 9/11 of 2001, the terrorist attack in New York City. And what you're going to find is that many crises share a common life cycle. Let me explain. And I'm going to divide this graph into three sections, the three phases of a crisis, if you will. We'll call it the initial phase, the peak phase, and then the ebb of a crisis. So let's start in the initial phase on the left side. You'll see two lines. The arc is really your attention. The blue line running up through the middle is really important, the knowledge line. That's how much we know at any point during the crisis. So imagine this, you're riding to work, you're into your normal daily routine, the television's on or radio's on, and all of a sudden there's a breaking news event. There's an event, a mobilization. And immediately as human beings, we begin to investigate. That's the investigation. And at no other point in the crisis will our attention be ramping up as quickly as it does in the initial phases of the crisis. Well, because our attention is ramping up, that is a hook for the media, right? The media says, I've got people looking for information. We're going to cover this wall to wall. And I want you to think about how pervasive media is right now, not only in terms of the number of outlets, but it's not just on your evening news anymore. It's in your pocket, it's on your desk, it's at the gas pump, it surrounds us, it's ubiquitous. And so the important thing you need to know about the initial phases of a crisis is that Dr. Coughlin at MIT says in this initial phase, the information that you'll be receiving is going to be constant, it's going to be conflicting, and it's going to be crushing. Well, why is that? Well, the fact is that everyone wants to jump on this attention bandwagon. Everyone wants to kind of tell you what they think is going on about this crisis. I want you to look very closely. Where are we in terms of knowledge at that point? The truth is we know very little about what's going on, but that doesn't stop dozens of talking heads on any channel you turn to telling you exactly what's going on, even though they don't know what's going on,
That's
right?
right. Everybody's a virus expert now on Facebook.
Everybody's an expert, right? So, well, Jeremy, I'd just ask you, think about the amount of information that we received in the last 30 to 45 days, let's say, that has been conflicting. How about things like, hey, this virus doesn't affect young people? Well, actually it does. Well, this virus is no different than the flu. Well, some say it is, some say it isn't. It appears to be extremely contagious, much more so maybe than influenza, but we can't even get good mortality figures on it because we don't have enough knowledge, right? Even simple things, Jeremy. I've been on God's green earth here for 53 years, thinking I knew all along how to wash my hands. Now find myself singing happy birthday twice at the bathroom sink, right? So we're learning new things, but in the initial phases of the crisis, the important thing is that we know very little, but the information we're getting is constant, conflicting, and crushing. In the second phase of the crisis, we move to what's called the peak. And the reason why our attention will eventually peak is at the very top of that arc, you see that the title preliminary assessment or preliminary allocation of blame. What this means, and it kind of depends what kind of crisis you're in, but eventually there will be an assessment of the situation. There may be a solution proposed that society will deem acceptable. Perhaps it's a breakthrough in a viral drug, or a vaccine breakthrough, or an economic package, or whatever it is that makes society kind of agree that we're starting to get our arms around this thing. And when it's not poised in the framework of a crisis anymore, we will find that our attention begins to fade. The reason we have allocation of blame up there is that, look, crises are different. Think about a crisis that's caused by corruption, let's say in the financial system or in the political system. Well, in that case, oftentimes we used to have a chief economist that would say, you know, you're at the peak of a crisis when you begin to see the orange jumpsuits and the handcuffs come out, right? Because we want to see the bad guy get it. The scary thing is that preliminary assessment or allocation of blame, it doesn't even have to be correct. It just has to be something that makes sense to people, that they begin to feel comfortable and will begin to fade in our attention. Now, what I will point out, Jeremy, is the difficult part about this is when we do hit that peak, when that event or series of events happen, you'll have no idea that it happened, right? You'll be wondering, has it happened yet? Is it still going to happen? It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly when that happens. So timing the peak of a crisis is as difficult as trying to time things in the markets, if you will.
Right. A lot of times, the dead bottom of the market in the financial crisis, if memory serves me right, was March 9th.
That's right.
And the actual peak of unemployment and many other things didn't happen again until November.
That's
So it was well before the actual peak of actual bankruptcies and unemployment. So you just don't know. You just don't know.
You don't.
Yeah.
And I'll show you a graphic later in my presentation which shows you the kind of the cost of not knowing, right? If we wait until we think the time is right, chances are oftentimes that right time has already come and gone. And so the
100%
timing,
the case.
it's so
100%
hard.
the case, John. It's like as investors out there, once they have their plan set up properly, right? So anybody who deals with me or wants to deal with me, I do design a plan specifically for them, and throughout their life there will be times of uncertainty, no question. But looking past that uncertainty, if the virus isn't permanent, market corrections aren't permanent. So looking past that valley to the other side and putting yourself in that spot, well, are we going to be okay in 2 years? And if you could, or 3 years, or whatever the number may be, if you do have it set up that way, then the anxiety level of it drops, and then when people can make much more thoughtful decisions at that point.
That's right. So, and you bring up a great point, Jeremy. I think one of the lessons that your clients can take away from my presentation today, hopefully, is that we want to do everything we can to move the decision point away from the moment of crisis, right? If we have an opportunity to think in a rational mindset and put together a plan based on, as you mentioned, our long-term objectives and our risk tolerances, and really the things that are personal to us, then being able to kind of keep that plan even during times of emotional upheaval is pretty important to making smart decisions in the long run. So let me talk about the last phase of the crisis. That's kind of where it starts where the knowledge line and the attention line kind of intersect. It's what we call the ebbing of the crisis. And what I always joke with people, Jeremy, I'll tell them, if you ever want to kill public interest in any topic or crisis, there's one surefire way to do it. Form a congressional subcommittee around it that's going to study it, right? Because as soon as they do that, we begin to turn the channel. And the sad part about that is by the time actions, policy changes, and reports are issued, we're not paying attention any longer, even though I want you to look, where are we at the knowledge point? We have more knowledge about what happened during that crisis than at any other point. But because it's not framed as a crisis anymore, we've begun to move on.
It's like people go to, some say people go watch NASCAR for the wrecks, not the.
That's right.
Yeah.
And really what the folks at MIT tell us is that any crisis eventually will pass for one of three reasons. One, they tell us that we can't run on red alert for 365 days a year, 24/7. Eventually, we will begin to adapt our routines. We will start doing new things and adapt to the environment around us. Human beings are incredibly adaptive. Think about it for a moment. How many of us don't even bat an eye when we're packing our bags to take a flight, that we know not to pack liquids over 4 ounces in our bag? You're going to get snagged by the TSA. That was all a result of a crisis, right? But we've adapted our behaviors because of that. So eventually we may develop new routines, that new normal, if you will. The second reason, I mentioned it in the peak, why crises will pass, is that someone will propose a solution that society deems acceptable and we'll move on from there. But the third and most prevalent reason is that tomorrow's crisis will take place of today's crisis, and tomorrow's crisis is oftentimes more personal and puts things in better perspective than what we were worried about yesterday. So eventually crises will pass, but the impact of anxiety on how we think as investors, we have to catch ourselves in this. MIT says we may begin to feel that the system has lost meaning. It no longer makes sense. Hey, I thought our healthcare system was terrific. I thought our public officials were ready for something like this, but everything seems like it stood on its head. The rules are broken. There are no longer any rules. Think about this current crisis. When you got sick or ill, where were you supposed to go? You're supposed to go to the hospital or to your doctor's office, but now you're told you can't go to the hospital or the doctor. You're going to put other people in jeopardy. And so this conflicting information, the rules are broken. There aren't any rules anymore. And it leads to the most disarming of all these perception realities. And that is, if we begin to feel powerlessness, this resignation that there's really nothing I can do, that really is a dangerous place to be, because there is always something that you can do. There's something that you can do that can influence your future outcome in some way. And so we'll talk about what some of those things are. So Jeremy, I want to transition. Before I go into the next section, Jeremy, any comments or questions that you kind of have?
Well, yeah. So for clients, some things like what some people may want to do is, like, when things get volatile, oh, I just want to sell out. That's what I can do, and just alleviate that the volatility, and that could be absolutely detrimental to their financial future. And but there's other things they can do that are much more constructive. Of course, talking to their financial advisor. Certainly feel free to call me. And there may be some things they can do within times like this that can help. You got the Secure Act, you've got the CARES Act, you've got tax law changes. There's dozens of things that have changed very, very recently that things may be able to, you may be able to do some things to help your individual situation in this time. That's constructive versus destructive.
Absolutely. I think, Jeremy, when we're in crises or times of anxiety, oftentimes we as human beings feel like we have to do something, right? To do nothing just means, so we have to do something. Unfortunately, if people don't know what the difference between positive actions and negative actions, they're likely to take negative actions, right? They're actually running headlong into the storm instead of away from it.
That's right. So a lot of times, it's difference between luck and skill in a different way. So you know, if you're at a casino, right, and you're a player at a casino, the odds are stacked against you. But if somehow you lucked up and won, well, being a casino player is a good investment. Well, we all know that's not the case. So differentiating between what is going to increase your chances of success and decrease your chances of success. So a lot of times people may get that confused, especially in times of crisis.
Well, it's a great segue, Jeremy, into talking about some of the things or some of the actions that can decrease our chances of success. So let me talk about three of them. The first thing that the researchers at MIT tell us about people in anxious or crisis situations is that we will invest attention in the negative. We will seek out negative information. Sometimes that's to confirm why we feel so poorly. Sometimes it's to put together theories of kind of what's going on. But here's what MIT says. They believe it's evolutionary in nature. You know, when we were hunters and gatherers out on the plain, we were always scanning the horizon for the next potential risk. It used to be in the form of a bush that was shaking out in the distance because there might have been something hiding behind the bush that would jump out and eat us. So we got anxious about that. We're not sure that our systems were built for the amount, the volume of negative information that now comes our way through all kinds of different mediums. So on the graph in front of you, we've actually graphed uh, Google searches for CNBC versus the S&P 500 index. And you'll see that when Google searches for CNBC peak, it's oftentimes when the markets take a dive, right? In fact, one of the highest viewership days for CNBC occurred on September 29th of 2008. And Jeremy, you may remember what happened that day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 777 points. What was the headline that day? Dow has worst day ever. Nobody remembers what happened the very next day. The very next day, September 30th, 2008, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rebounded 485 points, which at the time was the third biggest rebound of all time. Who remembers reading the headline, Dow has third biggest rebound? Nobody. It might have been there, but it probably was in section B, page 7, right? Because it didn't satisfy our craving for negative information. So the first thing I want you to understand is that it is instinctual to crave and search and find negative information. And I probably don't have to tell you, there are plenty of outlets out there to find it. And so what you're going to find is there's always a reason to panic. There's always a reason. I put on my graph here things that you may remember just since 2007, right? Whether it was through the Great Recession or certainly when Greece was implementing their austerity measures, the US Ebola breakout, right? We remembered it was in Africa, but all of a sudden it was in Atlanta. It was in the heartland, right? So all these things, there's always a reason not to invest. But the blue part of my graph shows the S&P 500 index. Despite all these reasons, economies innovate. Markets traditionally, historically, have continued to weather the storm over the course of time. Maybe not in the near term of a snapshot period of 3 months, 6 months, or a year, but over the course of time, you can see that equity markets have continued to grow, as evidenced on my graph here. So the
Yeah.
first thing I want you to be aware of, Jeremy, is be careful of our tendency to seek out just negative information.
Of course, of course. Charlie Munger, which is Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, brilliant guy. He talked about there are 24 um, causes for human misjudgment. There's the herd effect, doing what your neighbor does. There's confirmation bias, where, okay, I feel bad, therefore I'm going to look for reasons for me to feel bad. And there's many, many more, 22 plus more of these psychological causes of human misjudgment. And so all of those play a role in us, unfortunately, making poor decisions, especially in times of crisis.
Yeah. So the second aspect of our behaviors is that during times of crisis, anything that doesn't have a clear outcome, a guarantee, we view as bad, right? It must be bad. If it's not clear, it has to be bad. look, along the knowledge curve, the way we're going to learn things is by discovering through our mistakes, right? Take Thomas Edison, right? Discovering the light bulb. No, he didn't fail. He discovered 10,000 ways not to do it, right?
Right, right,
That's part of the process. But here's the problem, Jeremy, and I'm sure that you see this, is that when markets get fearful, when people get fearful, oftentimes we clamor for what is perceived as the safe investment or the guarantee. And unfortunately, during these times is when you're most apt to see those asset classes overpriced. You know why? Because there's a lot of people that feel the same way that we do about wanting guarantees and certainty, and they flock to those investments, which cause a distortion in the price mechanism. And it's
right.
just something we have to be aware of.
And that brings up another point, John, is that a lot of people, if they have their money set up properly within their risk tolerance and their financial plan, it gives them a lot more certainty about their worst case scenario. Okay. So let me explain. It's like, I've met with a guy at the beginning of the year and he said he's conservative. Well, his actual 401k at the time was like 90% stock, 10% bonds, which is pretty aggressive. And when he did his risk tolerance test, he comes out to be he should be 50-50 or 60-40, which is much, much, much more conservative. Fortunately, through our conversations and our planning, he reallocated his 401k, which saved him a ton of money when the market went down. And so having certainty about what you can control, which really is just a very small part of the picture, but it's the 80-20 principle. It's like what you can control may be a small part, but it really makes 80% of the difference in your financial life. Therefore, like when there are times of crisis, you have a comfort of knowing what your worst case scenario is, and you can stay the course a lot better if you do
And
have
look,
things set up that way.
in the midst of a crisis, I don't mean to say that, everything is going to be good that's not clear, but what we need to understand is, yes, there are things on the other side that could be bad, but there's also other things that could be good, right? There may be industries and companies and products and so on and so forth that stand to benefit from what we're going through right now in that acceleration that we talked about.
Hmm.
And there may be some that are going to be in a worse position on the other side. So keeping a balanced perspective here is pretty important.
That's right.
And lastly, Jeremy, I want to talk about a behavior called loss aversion. And in loss aversion, what we understand is people under anxiety or crisis situations will do anything to avoid losses or take any risk of any kind. And it's largely because of something that's called the pain of a loss. Behavioral psychologists have ascertained that the emotional pain of a loss is 2 to 3 times as great as the emotional joy of a gain. So the way I explain this to people, you're walking down the street, you look down at your feet, there's a $20 bill on the sidewalk in front of you. Nobody else is around you. The birds are singing, the sun's shining. You say, hey, it's my lucky day. You put that 20 in your pocket, keep walking down the street. 10 minutes later, you're passing the ice cream parlor and you say, I think I'm going to treat myself. So you got to reach into your pocket or your purse for that 20 and you can't find it. The fact that you can't find it will bother you 2 to 3 times as much as the fact that you ever found it in the first place, even though from a pure economic standpoint,
You're in the
you are
same
no
spot.
better or worse than when you
Right.
started walking down the sidewalk,
That is
right?
crazy. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so the reason I mentioned that, Jeremy, is that I put a graph up in front, which is equity market returns since 1926, year by year. And I always ask people 2 questions. Is there more red on this graph or more green? Well, there's more green. By a lot or a little? Well, actually by a lot. Well, why is it that we're so fearful of any kind of equity allocations during times of crisis? It's because if we look at that big red line back in 2008, wow, we still remember what that felt like. Even though it was, 12 years ago now, or 11 years ago, we remember how it felt when we didn't know if our employment would be stable. We didn't know if we'd have a domestic automaker. We didn't know kind of what the future held. And Jeremy, you mentioned March of 2009. I'm sure you've talked to people that have said, man, if only we could have invested a bunch of money back in March of 2009, think how well we would have done. It's easy to say in hindsight, but I want you to think about the emotion of actually investing at a time like that when things were so unclear. Difficult to do. I just wanted to share the real numbers with you on that graph. In that graph I just showed you, year by year returns in the equity market, 69 years were positive, 25 were negative. That's 73% positive years, 27% negative. And if we looked at years of great gain, defined as over 20%, versus great loss, the numbers are even more kind of disparate. 35 years of gains over 20%, only 6 years less than 20%, with an average annual return over that time of 10.2%. But it's those negatives that stick in our minds because we remember how they made us feel. And
Right.
so, Jeremy, just to illustrate the cost of panic in a crisis situation from a financial standpoint, I took a look at what I would call panic markets, right? So markets where it dropped from at least 30% from peak to trough. And although people may not remember the numbers, they probably remember waiting in gas lines with odd and even license plates to fill up their tank back in the early 70s, or Black Monday, or the dot-com bubble. I just want to share with you kind of how this illustrates. So if we look on my graph, I have 5 different investors who each invested $10,000 approximately around the beginning in 1970, right? And we look at 5 different strategies. One left all their money in equities. One took all their money and said, I only want it to be in really safe cash investments. The equity investor is the kind of the navy blue. That investor made out the best of anybody. They made just shy of $1.5 million by the end of 2019. But Jeremy, they rode up every peak and they rode every trough. They talk about anxiety. These are the people that probably say boo and they're stuck to the ceiling, right? Because they're living on the edge. Just have to have either nerves of steel or not even be kind of cognizant of what's going on around. But from an investment standpoint, they did okay. The ones who said, just don't invest me in cash and very safe instruments, represented by really short-term treasury securities, safe stuff, their 10,000 grew only to $136,000, which you may look at that number and say, that isn't bad. But I'll challenge you to remember the level of interest rates back in the early 1980s. I'm not sure that they could repeat that today with interest rates where they are. Then we look at the green line. That's the person who said, no, forget cash. Just put me in bonds. I want to invest 100% in bonds. Well, they did okay. They got $351,000. The red investor is the one that I really want you to pay attention to, though. There's no difference between the red investor and the all equity investor, except that when a crisis hit, when we hit one of those 5 panic markets, they hit the panic button and said, Jeremy, take me out of equities, take me out of the market, put me in cash, and let's just wait till things get better. So they waited 2 years, and then they went right back into the equity market. So if you think about it, this market, this graph runs 50 years. They only missed 10 of those years, but look what happened to their return. It almost cut it in half versus that all equity investor. But the moral of the story here, folks, is the light blue, the baby blue number there. That's what we call the balanced investor. And for ease of illustration, we just took an investor who said, put me 50% in stocks, 50% in bonds, and let it ride. And what you'll notice is they captured a greater part of that equity return than any of the other groups, but they didn't nearly have the volatility in the ride that the all equity investor did. They smoothed out some of those bumps. So the lesson here is being able to have a strategy and sticking to it can really help pay off when we look over the long run.
Yeah,
In fact, there
absolutely.
may be times, Jeremy, you may have heard this from folks, right? We go through a good stock market run and they'll say to you, Jeremy, why do we even own bonds? And then we hit a market like today. Why do we own stocks? Why do we own bonds? Why do we own stocks? You got to understand this is common for investing, right, Jeremy? You've seen this over the years, haven't you?
Right, of course. Yeah, exactly.
So folks, I want to kind of wrap up our discussion today by giving you a couple of things that you can do, or you can make sure you're doing to try and check yourself when you find some of these instinctual behaviors cropping up. The first thing I'm going to challenge you to do is seek out the positive, right? Because even though you're surrounded by negative information, there are positive things happening at the same time, but they're often obscured by the negative information that's out there. Some of America's greatest companies were founded during periods of recession or even crisis in the United States. Sometimes these companies come to the forefront because they have ideas, they have concepts that actually can help us overcome some of those challenging times. When we look at today's headlines, you may have to look a little deeper, but perhaps you'll find encouraging signs in terms of vaccine development or medical therapy, or perhaps preparing for the next pandemic. Jeremy, we put this slide together back in December of 2019. And I don't know if you realize this, but at the Consumer Electronics Show, which is the largest technology show, consumer technology show in the world, it was held in Las Vegas in January of 2020. Corning and OtterBox were already presenting at that show antimicrobial screen protectors that you could put on your phone or your iPad that would kill bacteria and potentially viruses on contact. Right. So when I talk about, companies who are adapting and thinking of newer technologies or services that we might need, maybe some of us throughout this crisis have used DoorDash or Grubhub or HelloFresh or any of these delivery services, which have been out there for a while. But now that we're forced to use them, we kind of look at them and say, wow, maybe there's something to this thing. But here's the catch, is that not everybody with a good idea makes a good investment. There's this crazy thing called valuation, right? We got to make sure that the price that we pay for companies and securities and funds and those kind of things are in line with the valuation of those companies, or at least there's a rational basis for investing.
Absolutely. And in my career, I started in '97, and that was at the top of the dot-com boom, and there was probably 90 to 95% of those companies back then are no longer in existence.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a few who were. There's a few who are. Of course, Google was around. It wasn't publicly traded back then, but Amazon was. And I remember it went from $90 a share down to $5 back in the dot-com bust. So whoever survives and has a product or service and has the capital and survives may do extremely well. But it's very difficult to choose that.
That's right.
And who's going to succeed in that. But
Mm-hmm.
as a consumer, though, we have a choice on what products we use, and we make these decisions every day. And there are going to be many fantastic things that do come from this, and businesses that are created in these times of crisis as well.
Yeah, and that's, I think, my point here, Jeremy, would be we're not trying to pick the single next great product or the single next big company. I just want people to realize that as much of the negative that's out there, there are positive things that are happening, and there will be positive consequences for lifestyles and for investments on the other side of this.
Absolutely. The red tape with getting drugs passed, and there's
Hmm.
so many things. I mean, the people who are watching this video now, it really would not have been available maybe in a few years ago in the format they're watching it now. So there's many things that are going to happen.
So,
Definitely.
Jeremy, the first thing is to seek out the positive, try to find it, right? Put
Right.
together a thesis for what might happen. The second thing is to have a plan. And Jeremy, we've talked a couple of times through this broadcast today about the importance of having a plan, but I just want to demonstrate a little bit about why it's so important, right? So if we didn't have a plan and every year we just kind of wanted to chase the winners and shun the losers, what I put in front of you is a graph. It looks like a periodic table of elements, right? But what it is different types of asset classes. So this isn't even individual securities. These are asset classes. And I want you to observe how difficult it is from year to year to pick winners and losers. Now, through the middle of this graph, because we have the best performers year by year listed up top and the worst obviously down the bottom, but you'll notice running throughout this graph, right about midway point to a little bit above midway point is a category called diversified portfolio, right? So again, that's taking a chunk of all these asset classes, having them represented. And what you'll see is You may not hit home runs, but you're certainly not going to strike out. And usually that diversified portfolio is what you want to do to make sure that you're earning consistent returns over time. And so having a plan, the key thing to not making emotional decisions is having a plan when you enter into a time of upset or turmoil. And I'll just share with you, if you don't have a plan, I would encourage you 100% to get a hold of Jeremy and sit down and talk with him about your long-term goals, about your risk tolerances, a little bit about how you think about money, what concerns you, how opportunistic that you think markets are or opportunities are, and you put together a plan around those inputs that's personalized to you. And one other thing, if you already have a plan, I would encourage you to be careful about making sure to revisit that plan from time to time. Sit down and have a conversation with Jeremy about, I put this together maybe 5 years ago, but things have changed, right? My kids have grown now. My job is different. I retired. It's very important because look, it's not a snapshot. Life goes on in a continuum, and that you want that plan to have the flexibility to adapt. When I say adapt, I don't mean giant swings one way or the other, but based on your life objectives and where you currently stand, talking with an advisor who has experience in looking at these things to monitor that and make suggestions for you is really key.
Yeah.
And that brings me to, I'm sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
No, that's absolutely true. When you have a game plan, I mean, every pilot knows his, contingency plan when things happen. Ships, everything happens. There's contingency plan of people who are professionals, whether it be, doctors, pilots, uh, everybody. So it's good for us or for clients who are looking to retire, stay retired, put kids through college, pay their taxes, to have plans, contingency plans, and,
Hmm.
and to review those on a regular basis.
Yep. And that leads me into my third point, which is don't go it alone. I don't know, especially in this crisis, Jeremy, I think that one of the things we've all suffered from is a little bit of social isolation, right? We don't get to see the friends and neighbors and professionals in our lives that we normally get to see, right? So we sit in our homes, we watch TV, it scares the living daylights out of us, and we're there alone with our thoughts, right? We think, wow, maybe I should abandon that plan that I had. Maybe I should sell out. And by the way, the same thing happens in real positive markets, right, Jeremy? So the opposite of what may happen here, people may say, oh my gosh, I'm missing it. Let's pile 100%, forget the plan. Let's get in now before it's too late. We see these emotional swings both in your euphoric times and in difficult times. But here's the key. Don't go it alone. One
Well,
of the most underestimated aspects of working with a great, competent advisor is having someone to sound your ideas off of before you press that button to take action, right? Because on the screen, I put up index performance versus average investor performance. And you see that the indices far outperform the investors. Why? Because investors have a tendency to do the exact wrong thing at the exact wrong time. We react with our emotions. It's the emotional part of our brain versus the rational part of our brain that takes over. And I would just encourage you, if you get into a kind of a situation where you're feeling really nervous and you're feeling like you need to do something, I highly recommend that you talk to somebody like Jeremy, who might act as a circuit breaker, right? To say, let's just talk about this. Because I know Jeremy mentioned about how long he's been in the business. He's seen a lot of similar cycles. He's seen a lot of the mistakes that people can make. And he might be able to provide you with some insight that might make you feel a little bit better by keeping things perhaps in better perspective. So please don't go it alone.
absolutely. It's all this in the dark is not bad, and there are people like myself who's been through this, through things like this, that can actually see a lot better than what you may see. And so having competent, experienced, certified advisors, it would certainly put the odds in your favor.
So, Jeremy, today we talked about the relationship between stress, anxiety, and crisis. I mentioned those three behaviors, right? And these are just three. There are others, but these are of primary importance. Seeking attention in the negative, ambiguity is bad, and loss aversion. And then we talked about three ways to begin to deal with those things: seeking out positive information, making sure we have a plan, and not going it alone. I'm going to end with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Michael Lewis, who wrote The Blind Side, The Big Short, a couple of others. Michael Lewis says, "How many times does the end of the world as we know it need to arrive before we realize that it's not the end of the world as we know it?" Again, folks, I think we would be well served in times of crisis to take a deep breath, maybe take a walk outside, right? And get some fresh air and step back from the current crisis and begin to think rationally about, although we may not have seen the particulars before, we have been through other crises, especially from an investment standpoint. The markets have been volatile in the past. We have been through bear markets. We've been through bull markets as well, and realize that, this is, everything is a process. And how can we best make that process work for our betterment on the far side of the current crisis that we're in? So, Jeremy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate your insightful information here. As always, call me with any questions you may have. My number is 843-222-6602, 843-222-6602, or email me at jeremy@riverbendwm.com. I've got a YouTube channel. This is where this video will be. Facebook page. What my intention is to share pertinent, actionable information to help you make better decisions with your financial life. And I'm also here to help you. Okay. No cost in having a conversation with me at any point in time. I'll help you shoot you in the right direction. Thank you very much. And God bless. Bye.